Good evening, everyone. I am Sarangama Juneja, a student of fourth year, and today me and my colleague Sam, also in fourth year, are going to be discussing olfactory and gustatory pathway, olfactory nerve question, as part of the neuroanatomy final question lecture series that we are organizing for you. Sam, you can take it from here.
Yeah. Hi guys, my name is Sam. I'm also a fourth year medical student. So starting right on, we're talking about olfactory pathway, which is one of our oldest senses and still used by many animals today as their key sense to orient themselves in the outside world. Olfactory pathway is a two neuron tract pathway, unlike gustatory pathway, which is a three neuron tract pathway. Uh, it also does not decussate, meaning it does not cross the midline. Uh, it's basically mediated by olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve out of the 12 cranial nerves, and is actually one of the only cranial nerves that only transmits special sensory information. Um as you already know, we have olfactory epithelium in the cranial or superior part of the nasal cavity. The olfactory pathway has different types of cells or neurons. We have olfactory cells that are basically receptor cells in the olfactory epithelium, and olfactory nerve that carry the information from the olfactory epithelium to the olfactory bulb, which is uh, uh, which basically sits above the cribriform plate in the anterior cranial fossa. Then after that, we have olfactory striae that are divided into medial and lateral striae that I'm going to talk about it later, and olfactory cortex, uh, where the conscious perception of the smell happens. Next page, please. Yeah, as you see in the picture, you can see, starting from the below, you can see the olfactory epithelium, which is in the superior part of the nasal cavity. It's also surrounded by other cells, other than bipolar cells, which are the first order neuron of the olfactory pathway. These other cells are sustentacular cells, also called supporting cells, and stem cells or basal cells that I'm going to talk about later. After that, the bipolar cells are going to basically, the axons from bipolar cells are going to move through the cribriform plate to the olfactory bulb, which is an ovoid structure in the anterior cranial fossa. In the olfactory bulb, we have special types of neurons cells called mitral cells, and the connection between the axons of the bipolar cells and mitral cells is going to be called uh, granular cell. From there, we have the axons of mitral cells are going to move toward the posterior part of the move posteriorly, uh, and form something that is called olfactory tract. They move posteriorly till they reach a place called olfactory trigone, which is very close to optic chiasm. And from there, it's going to be divided into lateral stria and medial stria. The reason this division also correlates with how old the olfactory system is and how new and developed each part of the olfactory system is. The medial olfactory stria is generally the oldest part of the olfactory system because it's basically sense connections to septum varum, which has septal nuclei that are involved in limbic system, and also it crosses via anterior commissure to the contralateral olfactory bulb. These connections, as I said, goes to limbic system and hypothalamus, so they are really primitive and they're really old. On the other side, we have lateral olfactory stria, which go to two places. One is basically peripreform cortex, preform cortex, entorhinal area, and amygdala, which are basically going to limbic system. and is less old than the nearer one, which is less old than the middle olfactory sphere, but still really old. And one thing that is important to mention is that all these systems also enter entorhinal area. They are not responsible for conscious perception of the smell, but they are more responsible for emotions that are associated with the smell or other or motivation, for example, in the patient after in the individual after sensing a special smell. After that, we have also lateral olfactory striae has connections to the thalamus, which goes to the orbitofrontal cortex, which, as you know, is the inferior part of the frontal lobe in the prefrontal cortex, and it's basically the nervous system, and it's responsible for the conscious perception of the smell. So if you have a lesion, if you have a lesion in the orbitofrontal cortex, you will have problem with distinguishing smells and percepting smells. Next page, please. Next page, please. So some clinical implications when you have a problem with smell. We have dysosmia. Basically, in medical terminology, this means bad, and osmia is a smell, so bad smell. This osmia generally means any alteration in the quality of the smell. It could be generally categorized into two categories. First one being parosmia, which is basically smelling something differently than you remember it remember it how it smelled. And phantosmia is basically smelling something that is not there. So there is no smell, but you're thinking that you're smelling something. Then we have anosmia, is basically lack of smell, and there are several etiologies that could cause anosmia. A lot of them are really connected to the neurologic degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease or MS. Also, some other brain injuries like brain tumors or aneurysms, even head trauma could cause anosmia.
Okay. So moving on to the gustatory pathway. Here, the best way to study this would also be just being able to draw the scheme here essentially. So for the gustatory pathway, we divide the tongue into the anterior 2/3 in the posterior 1/3 and the other 1/3 essentially. So here the first 2/3 is innervated by facial nerve, which is cranial number 7. Then you have cranial number 11, and then you have cranial number 10. As you see on the next slide, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue with facial number 7. Very important reference here would be that it's the chordal tympani branch, which goes into the geniculate ganglion. Posterior 1/3, which would be the lingual branch of glossopharyngeal, and it goes into the inferior or petrosal ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then you have the remaining, which is connected to the pharynx and which goes into the superior laryngeal part of the 10th nerve, going into the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve. The one thing that's important here is that all of these eventually end up in the solitary nuclear complex, which is connected to the hypothalamus and the limbic system. They have functions as previously described by Sam. Limbic system usually mostly responsible for the functions of emotions, and hypothalamus for regulating metabolism. Then we have the next slide where we're talking essentially about the olfactory nerve. Sam spoke a lot about the pathway of it. You need to know the pathway with perfection, as well as the fact that it's the shortest cranial nerve and it's derived from the olfactory placode, which becomes relevant for anatomy and histology. So, next slide, talking about the pathway, it's important to be able to draw a map in your head essentially. So we talk about how it starts from the nasal epithelium, goes into the olfactory bulb, which is in the anterior cranial fossa. After that, it gets all of the olfactory nerve, and the cells, the fibers, get collected in the synaptic glomeruli, and then it moves into the olfactory tract, which is the most important thing being that it's present in the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. You have the lateral and the medial stria that was spoken about already, so all the information is on the slide. And then we talk about how the primary olfactory cortex sends nerves to various areas of the brain. And amygdala, olfactory tubercle, and the secondary olfactory cortex being really important locations. And I think we can move on to the next slide, which is the function. Yeah, Sam, I think you can take it from here.
Yeah. One thing to mention, I think I forgot to mention, is that I think I mentioned the first order neuron in the olfactory pathway being the bipolar nerve, which is correct. But I forgot to mention that the mitral cells are actually the second order neuron. So olfactory pathway is a two-order neuron pathway, the first one being bipolar nerve, the second order neuron being the mitral cells that are located in the olfactory bulb. So the function, as I said in the beginning of the lecture, I said we have different types of cells in the olfactory epithelium that is located in the superior part of the nasal cavity. Starting off with basal cells, which are basically the stem cells, and they basically make new olfactory cells. Subtentacular cells or supporting cells are basically analogous to the glial cells in the CNS. What they do, for example, could be a lot of the functions is basically phagocytosis of maybe, for example, the smell particles or even dead neurons and the debris, a lot of things. That's why they're called supporting cells. And then we have also olfactory receptor cells that are bipolar neurons that have dendrites that are in contact with the smell particles. And then we have axons that move through the cubicle plate toward the olfactory bulb to the synaptic glomeruli and to make connections with the mitral cells. And lastly, we have Bowman's glands that secrete mucosa in the secrete mucosa in the superior part of the nasal cavity. So the function is basically uh, for the sensory uh, perception of the smell, to get the information, to be in contact with the outside world and to understand the stimuli from the olfactory particles, and then send this information, transform it into electrical signal and send it via the bipolar nerves to the olfactory nerve, to the olfactory bulb, and through the olfactory tract to the olfactory trigon and medial and lateral stria to different parts of the brain to perceive it and also associate it with emotions and memory.
Perfect. I think that's all we have to say.
Thank you so much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we hope you learned a little something. And goodbye and good luck for your finals.